All right. I'm just taking this stuff down. I updated the title also.
I updated the title too. Um, I just can't update the X one.
We watched this really badass presentation webinar the other day, and it's like about kratom related deaths and like pretty much everything that goes into it. You know what I mean? And this dude's from like NMS Labs. NMS Labs, which I guess they do a lot of the toxicology. Um, my volume's on. Hold on. Sorry, my
Let me
bad.
get my headphones.
Um, but it's really, really good. Like it's a must watch. But we actually watched another one. We're waiting on the recording for that one. But I got them kind of confused, and what is why I had to change the title name. But this one's very good.
It is very good. They are.
Excelente.
Hold on, like,
They are giving like, so they're like the I don't know, they got to be like the top medical toxicologists, and they're giving like an update to all the other toxicologists and people in the field and all that stuff about kratom related deaths.
Right. And all this, all the factors that could go into,
Yep.
why something gets deemed a kratom related death. And I don't know, it's really interesting. This dude, he explains everything really well.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really. The whole ambiance of the webinar was really cool too.
It was even meeting people that were in the chat that were kratom consumers themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
I forgot I was the one supposed to start it. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, I can't change the title on the X post. I don't know if it'll let me do it after the fact or what. I don't know.
It probably will after the fact.
Gotta pay more attention to titles.
You know me, dude.
Okay.
Okay.
Y'all get ready. Take some notes.
Dr. Brower is a forensic toxicologist who joined NMS Labs in 2022. He earned his Bachelor's of Arts in Chemistry at Adams State University and his PhD in Organic Chemistry at the University of Nevada. He completed a postdoctoral fellowship through the Cancer Research Institute at the University of California, Irvine, where he focused on peptides and protein-protein interactions. Following his postdoctoral work, he served as Director of Chemistry at a biotechnology startup in Charleston, South Carolina, and as a laboratory supervisor and forensic toxicologist at the North Carolina office of the Chief Medical Examiner. From his drug discovery work, he holds multiple U.S. and international patents and has published extensively on the synthesis and study of novel therapeutics. He is widely published in the opioid metragine, or Kratom, and frequently presents at major conferences and scientific meetings. So we are extremely happy to have him with us today. Dr. Flower, please proceed with your presentation, From Leaf to Lab, Kratom-Related Deaths in an Evolving Alkaloid Landscape.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. And thank you all for being here today. I greatly appreciate it. Kratom is a topical topic. It's a hot topic right now. I know, 26% of you are, fairly concerned about it. And I think you might be a little bit more concerned about kind of where we're going in this evolving alkaloid landscape by the end of this talk. So I am a paid employee by NMS Labs, or we are. My colleagues, Donna Papsum and Bill Schroeder, we all work together on these types of talks and presentations and publications. So we are paid employees, and we do like being paid. That's one of the best parts of working at NMS. So what is kratom? Well, kratom is really just a tree. It's a tropical evergreen tree, native to Southeast Asia, like Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia. It belongs to the coffee family, from where we get, obviously, coffee, but also other drugs like quinine from the quinine tree. They're chock full of alkaloids. Alkaloids kind of by definition are very bitter in taste. And with kratom, they have both stimulant and opioid-like effects depending upon the dosage. And we get most of our kratom from Indonesia. They're one of the world's largest exporters of it. Traditionally, kratom has been used ethnobotanically for centuries to treat fatigue and pain. People could chew on leaves to get a little bit of a stimulant property from the alkaloids present within that leaf. It's kind of akin to, say, laborers in Peru chewing on coca leaves to extract out, that sweet cocaine while they're working to help get them through the day. But the most common preparation traditionally is decoctions and teas. And a decoction is just a fancy word for saying just a really strongly brewed tea. So they might brew or boil the leaves in water for hours and hours so they can be fairly concentrated. But what's surprising is that there's really no known overdose deaths attributed solely to kratom use in Southeast Asia. And, the caveat there is, their own death investigations and toxicological work and, autopsies and things like that. They may not always be identical to what we're used to in our areas. But still, if there were a lot of widespread deaths, it would have come to light already. But that's not kind of the same thing that we have here in the United States, where we kind of like to ruin things. We always have to supersize things and fortify and adulterate them. We're not using it in a traditional sense. And so you can go to gas stations and smoke shops or online and you can buy, capsules and powders and, extracts and these extract shots. You might have seen them on the counter at a gas station or a convenience store. So these are, very concentrated kratom extracts, as a so-called legal high is what we used to call them, a decade ago. Most people in the United States use it to increase focus or their concentration. It's not exactly like a caffeine type stimulant. It's more just you're more focused on the task at hand. So you don't have that jitteriness or that tension that you get with, drinking, 8 cups of coffee like I used to, or, downing liters of Diet Coke and things like that. So it's not the typical stimulant type effect that you're used to. People use it for relaxation, kind of like a mild euphoria, maybe like an anxiolytic to control anxiety or to control chronic pain. And a very large number of people will use it to try to stave off withdrawal symptoms from an opioid addiction or dependence. So if they want to try to get off of using fentanyl or oxycodone, they often turn to kratom use so that they don't have those withdrawal symptoms and keep them, quote, drug free. But as in contrast to the Southeast Asian countries, we do have many overdose deaths, either in combination with other drugs, such as CNS depressants, like benzodiazepines or opioids. But we also see overdose deaths due to kratom use alone as well. In the United States, kratom is legal at the federal level, but there are several states that have banned it completely. So it's illegal to buy or sell in these states. And I won't read them off because you have eyes and you can probably read them too. So federal bans have been contemplated. I think it was like 2015, give or take a year. There was an open comment period for the DEA thinking about scheduling kratom and its primary alkaloid, metragenine. There was a huge pushback from the general public. And so they decided not to schedule kratom and its alkaloids. And so it thus is still legal at the federal level. So getting into the pharmacology of kratom. So like any natural product, you take a natural product, some plant species, and it's chock full of different chemicals and substances in it. And kratom's no different. There are about 50 or so different alkaloids present within that kratom leaf. From that leaf, that dried leaf material, the alkaloids only make up about 1.52% or so of that leaf product. Of those alkaloids, mitragynine is the most prominent. It's about 2/3 of those alkaloids are going to be mitragynine. And then you have trace amounts of those other 49 different alkaloids. And one that I do want to highlight here now, because we'll see it later, is 7-hydroxymitragynine, which makes up less than 1% typically. In the body, mitragynine has a very long half-life. So the half-life is the amount of time it takes for the body to cut the concentration in half. And it has a half-life of 8 to greater than 24 hours. It also has a very large volume of distribution. The volume of distribution is really just a ratio of how much of the drug partitions in your tissues and your fats compared to that of circulating freely in the blood. And this has a really large volume of distribution, reported to be between 60 and 120 liters per kilogram. So it's, when I look at the structure of mitragynine, it's just a big ball of fat to me. So you can just look at it and just know it wants to partition in tissues and into fat. And what this means from a toxicological standpoint is that it will accumulate in the body because of that very long half-life. So if someone is consuming kratom chronically or daily, they're not clearing all of those alkaloids, especially mitragynine, from the body before their next use. So it's just going to keep building and building and building. And with that very large volume of distribution, you're going to have a huge amount in your tissues. And so that's going to make it prone to post-mortem redistribution. So once you die and you start decomposing and those cells burst open, releasing all their contents, it's going to be releasing a lot of mitragynine and all those other alkaloids, going from that area of high concentration in the tissue to relatively lower concentrations in the blood. So post-mortem, you can have extremely high concentrations in central blood specimens, which are most likely affected. So it'll be higher after death than it was at the time of death. And just to give you a frame of reference, because we'll be talking about concentrations later on, therapeutic concentrations, so like say a 1 gram capsule or 3 grams of tea that have been brewed, maximum concentrations are right around 100 nanograms per milliliter, give or take, and it takes about an hour to achieve that maximal concentration. On the receptor side of things, I mentioned before that it's a stimulant effect at a low dose and more, sedative and relaxing effects at higher doses. And some of that is due to its, weak partial opioid agonism. So it does bind and activate the opioid receptor, but it doesn't do a very good job at it at all. It's just a weak partial agonist, really at best. So compared to, morphine, it's about 50 times weaker or so in, affinity and activity. But what's really interesting about mitragynine is that it has a biased agonism. So there are two different signaling pathways for opioids. One is the G protein signaling, and one is the beta-arrestin signaling. Most common opioids that we have today prefer signaling through the beta-arrestin pathway, whereas mitragynine really prefers the G protein signaling. The G protein signaling is usually responsible for kind of the good parts of opioids. So the analgesic effects, the euphoric effects, those are mediated by the G protein signaling. The beta-arrestin is really the deleterious effects, the things that you don't want, like respiratory depression and constipation and tolerance. Those are more signaled through the beta-arrestin pathway. So really kind of what you get is kind of more of the good parts of opioid receptor activation compared to the bad side effects that you pretty much don't want. And like most drugs, they're fairly promiscuous, so they'll bind to a lot of different receptors as well, such as the adrenergic, and serotonin and dopamine as well. There are some analytical challenges in the laboratory. There are 3 chiral centers in mitragynine. You can kind of see them with these little red stars here. What this means is that you're going to have sets of diastereomers. So these are non-superimposable mirror images of each other, and they have to be separated in the laboratory. If you don't separate them chromatographically, then all of those analytes or drugs get smushed together, and then it can falsely elevate the concentration that you're calculating. Another issue is stability. In a nutshell, it's not very good. At NMS, we have about a 30-day stability window. And for some of these other alkaloids that we're talking about, we either don't know what the stability is, or it's just very, very poor, like 7-hydroxymitragynine. My recommendation would be that if you have a known case of a kratom intoxication or a kratom-related death, to get those specimens, blood specimens, and then freeze them before analysis, just to keep it from degrading. So at NMS, we've been looking at mitragynine for a number of years now, I think about 7 or 8 now. And we've seen some really interesting trends over those years. Really, pretty much everything is increasing over time. Not only the number of cases that we have, but just like our mean and median concentrations. So I have data here from 2018 through 2024. I have not calculated all of 2025 yet, but it'll be probably fairly similar to what we see in 2024. But you can see from 2018 through 2024, our mean concentrations, our average mitragynine concentration in our postmortem cases has nearly doubled. Our median, our middle concentration, has almost doubled as well, going from 120 to 220. And our ranges as well. So in 2018, our highest concentration was 7,000. And in 2024, it was 21,000. And also our positivity rate. So in our postmortem cases in 2018, just over 1% of our casework had positive results for mitragynine. And in 2024, it's just under 2%. So we've seen a pretty big rise in our positivity rate for mitragynine. So nearly everything has increased. We have very wide ranges, but they do tend to skew kind of towards the higher end. So when we have that mean concentration larger than the median, that means we have some, I wouldn't really call them outliers, but we just have some really, really high concentrations that are kind of elevating that average concentration. And then the other caveat is looking for mitragynine and other kratom alkaloids does require targeted screening at NMS and probably everyone's lab. We do that through time of flight mass spec. And the other caveat is that we only test what we get. We have no control over what our submitting agencies or clients submit to us. What's most interesting about this data to me is the number of cases above 1,000 nanograms per mil. You'll see in a little bit, 1,000 is kind of my threshold for thinking about mitragynine and kratom use as a possible cause of death. It doesn't mean it necessarily is, but that's when I start thinking about it possibly being a cause of death. So in 2018, we only had 70 cases greater than 1,000, and by 2024, we had 285 greater than 1,000, representing about almost 20% of our mitragynine positive cases. So of our mitragynine positive cases, almost 20% were greater than 1,000 nanograms per mil, which is quite a lot larger or greater than those therapeutic-ish concentrations I was talking about earlier of right around 100 for a single dose. So we're seeing some really, really large concentrations. All of these trends could just be due to rising popularity and availability, because you can find it everywhere, online, convenience stores, gas stations, smoke shops. We're starting to see ads all over the place, as you'll see. And a lot of it is not necessarily abuse, but it could be misuse. These are not regulated drugs at all. There's very little oversight in them. And so they don't always tell you exactly how to use these products. So people are left to their own devices or just suggestions from random people on the internet. So again, not necessarily abuse. There certainly could be, and certainly is, but I wouldn't say every single person is abusing kratom. So we have one case of a 33-year-old male. He had a history of hypertension, which I think we all do in America, some degree of hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, some sleep apnea, and he was walking with his mother into an airport. And when he was in the airport, he just suddenly just collapsed, had what was called seizure-like activity, but he did not have a seizure disorder. Because he was in an airport, EMS was very quick to get to him, administered life-saving procedures, but he was still pronounced dead at the emergency department. And his cause of death was ruled as metragine toxicity with a concentration of 9,800 nanograms per milliliter. And everything else that we found, the amphetamine, the doxylamine, hydrocodone, all of those are, therapeutic concentrations and not related to the cause of death. Then we have a 21-year-old woman with a history of fibromyalgia. She was last seen alive 45 minutes prior to death or prior to being found, acting, quote, normal. So it's not like she was stumbling around, slurring her words, just walking and talking like normal, and then later found dead. She couldn't be resuscitated, and there's no anatomical cause of death. She had therapeutic concentrations of various other drugs, and then a whopping 4,300 nanograms per mil of metragine. And then this 30-year-old male found dead at his rail yard where he worked at, had some vomit in his mouth and trachea, but no aspiration, which you might see with like an opioid overdose. And he had no anatomical cause of death. And again, some therapeutic or subtherapeutic concentrations of imipramine, and then 4,500 nanograms per mil of metragine. And the pathologist ruled that the cause of death was metragine toxicity. And these are really kind of our standard type of cases that we see in kratom-related deaths. They're usually younger people, in their 20s and in their 30s. They tend to trend towards the males. But what's also really important is that they don't present as an opioid overdose death. When I first started testing for metragine and getting more involved in kratom, especially in the field of postmortem forensic toxicology, the prevailing thought at the time was that, metragine is an opioid. That's kind of what we heard. But they don't present like opioid overdose deaths. So at autopsy, if someone has an opioid overdose, you can usually see that. They'll have maybe a foam cone or like purge coming out of their nose and their mouth. They might have heavy lungs, pulmonary edema, congestion, early bronchial pneumonia. All of those are signs of an opioid overdose death, as well as urinary retention in the bladder. But all these cases, hundreds of them that I've talked to pathologists about over the years, they don't seem like an opioid overdose death. There aren't people that are, appear intoxicated at all. They're walking and talking like normal, like the young man with his mom walking to an airport. Everything's fine. And then they just have a sudden collapse in death. So there is likely a cardiac component, some cardiotoxicity associated with either metragine or some of the other kratom-related alkaloids. And these people at autopsy, they're also not finding huge amounts of kratom material or capsules in their gastric contents. So it's not like they were downing, handfuls of kratom capsules at all. So again, we're not seeing like green sludge from that powder in their gastrics components. They're not finding like these, what we call like ghost pills, these empty capsules, these gel caps, or the gel caps coagulating with each other, kind of forming like a mass or anything like that. It's usually pretty empty inside. So again, they don't look like an opioid overdose death. They seem like a sudden death, and we're not seeing tons and tons and tons of kratom product in their gastric contents. So my recommendations for metragenine is when it's above 500 nanograms per mil. That's when I start thinking about contributing it with other drugs. And those would typically be CNS depressants like opioids, like oxycodone or fentanyl. Again, because people use it to stave off withdrawal symptoms because they have a prior use history of using or abusing opioids. We often see metragenine and opioids together, as well as with benzodiazepines. When it starts getting above 1,000 nanograms per mil, that's when I start thinking about it as a cause of death. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the cause of death. You have to take into consideration the totality of the case, the autopsy findings, and the investigative side of things. But at least it should just be in the back of your mind to at least be thinking about it, at least. So while the harm may be low because it's been used for centuries, ethnobotanically, usually as teas with fairly low relative risk, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's harmless. You know, our common saying in forensic toxicology is that the dose makes the poison. Some of you even have it tattooed on you, I know. But how do you get to 1,000 nanograms per mil? Again, take a capsule or take some tea, you know, you're probably just under 100 nanograms per mil. So how do you get to these like 4s and 5 and 6 and 10 and 21,000? I think a lot of it is, again, that chronic use, that multiple daily use with that really long half-life. So it's just accumulating in the body over time. And then also that very large volume of distribution. So that's going to be make it prone to post-mortem redistribution. And so that's something that you really need to look at as well when you're looking at, say, central versus peripheral blood specimens. But our thoughts on metragenine are always evolving. You know, the thoughts that I had, you know, 10, 12, 14 years ago are very different than the thoughts that I have today. So again, with more cases and more data, we can have more informed thoughts on how to attribute metragenine and kratom to causes of death. But there's also the thought of, well, what about all those other alkaloids? Because I said, hey, there's like 50 of them. Well, what about those other ones? Do we know anything about those? Could those be harmful? Could those be good? You know, what's going on with those? Because when you take metragenine, it's metabolized in your liver to 7-hydroxymetragenine. And then the 7-hydroxymetragenine is rearranged to a compound called metragenine pseudoindoxyl. And this is important because when we already looked at the opioid activity and affinity of morphine or metragenine compared to morphine. But we also have the 7-hydroxymetragenine. So it's a stronger opioid. It's probably about 5 times greater in an affinity and activity than metragenine itself, but it's still not a very potent opioid when you're talking about opioids such as like oxycodone or hydrocodone or especially fentanyl. But when you look at metragenine pseudoindoxyl, it's a full opioid agonist. You know, it has nanomolar and subnanomolar affinity and activity at the opioid receptor. And this is kind of reaching like fentanyl proportions. You know, this is kind of like the profile that you would associate with really strong opioids like fentanyl. And so this may account for metragenine's analgesic activity and toxicity itself, especially with high doses being consumed or, you know, large amounts chronically. And this isn't lost on people that sell kratom products. Years ago, this strain called red bintrongi came out where they claimed that it had a unique fermentation process that transforms mitragynine into 7-hydroxymitragynine and mitragynine pseudoindoxyl. That unique fermentation process, I don't think it's patented at all. It's just really just putting the leaves in a wet burlap bag and letting it sit outside for a while and letting nature do its thing. So not very scientific at all. But what they did do is they made what they claim is a product with an alkaloid content several times more potent than mitragynine itself. And again, this is us just, westernizing things. Honestly, when you look up, why we can't have nice things, I think a map of America probably shows up in the dictionary. We can't take something good. We have to make it better. And in doing so, really kind of make things worse. So you can buy 7-hydroxymitragynine and mitragynine pseudoindoxyl online. So you can buy tablets of 7-hydroxymitragynine, tablets that you just put in your mouth and chew or dissolve. You can buy like kratom extract shots that have high concentrations of the 7-hydroxymitragynine. If you want to buy bulk powder, you can as well. And then you can buy that pseudoindoxyl powder as well. And that's kind of scary because, again, it's a full opioid agonist. And honestly, the worst part of this pseudoindoxyl that I have here is the voodoo doo-doo name, and that I didn't come up with it because that's like the best thing ever. So I'm sad that wasn't me that came up with that. So all of these products you can easily buy online. But I'm even starting to see ads on YouTube as well. So a couple weeks ago, I was watching, it's probably a cooking video or something like that, like Sam the Cooking Guy or something like that. And up popped an ad, and I snapped a picture of it really fast, selling simply 7-OH, which is 7-hydroxymitragynine. So, they're advertising these products, on very popular platforms and social media platforms. So it's got a very wide marketing. They're trying to attract, large numbers of people. And again, that could also be accounting for why we're seeing so much mitragynine, in our casework over time. So what was the NMS response to these products being more widely available? Well, we added the mitragynine pseudoindoxyl and the 7-hydroxymitragynine to our time of flight screen. So those would be what we consider our out of scope findings. So it's just qualitative, not quantitative, just qualitative, that we use for surveillance purposes, and they're not reported. So it won't show up on a report, but what happens is we see it and it's like, wow, this is a lot of pseudoindoxyl or a lot of 7-hydroxymitragynine. We would then reach out to the client and say, hey, these are the findings that we have. Here are some things that we could do with it. What next steps would you like us to take? So we've only been doing this for several months now. I think it was in the fall when we added it to our time of flight screen, our TOF screen. But we're seeing some interesting trends. When we see relative to one another, like a large amount of mitragynine and a little bit of 7-hydroxy and the pseudoindoxyl, I kind of take that to be the normal mitragynine metabolism, like what you saw before, metabolizing mitragynine to the 7-hydroxy and then to the pseudoindoxyl. But then we're seeing cases with, say, equal amounts of mitragynine and the hydroxy and the pseudoindoxyl. So that could be the regular kratom use, maybe being supplemented with 7-hydroxy or the pseudoindoxyl. And then we're seeing cases with huge amounts of the 7-hydroxy and pseudoindoxyl and maybe little or no mitragynine at all. And those are likely just the 7-hydroxy and or the pseudoindoxyl products with a little bit of mitragynine as an impurity. So the 7-hydroxy and the pseudoindoxyl are made from mitragynine. And if not all of the mitragynine is converted, then you're going to have a little bit of mitragynine essentially as an impurity. It's almost like that of illicit fentanyl, where you have a little bit of 4-ANPP in that product, and you can still see it in fentanyl users. You find that 4-ANPP. It's not as a metabolite. It's really just an impurity in the synthesis of that illicit fentanyl. So this is very similar to that. All right, so we have 2 cases I'm going to go through with you. This was a 20-year-old male. He was living with several other guys. No one had seen him for several days, so they entered his room, found him dead on his bed. He had froth in his airway and pulmonary edema at autopsy. And as I mentioned before, those are signs of an opioid overdose. That doesn't necessarily mean it is an opioid overdose, but those are common signs associated with opioid overdoses. They found 6 bottles of a 7-hydroxymetragenine product, these shots or concentrated extracts in the trash. There is no metragenine found at all from our NMS testing, but we sent the specimen over to CFSRE, the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education, which is a fantastic resource for all of you. So you should check them out, get on their mailing list. They always keep us up to date with new drug trends. And they found the presence of the 7-hydroxymetragenine and the pseudoindoxil, again, coming from that 7-hydroxymetragenine product that he was consuming. And then this one I just came across yesterday, and the forensic pathologist was nice enough to give me all the information she had. This was a 30-year-old male. He worked with in his family's tobacco shop. He was found deceased at home, prone on the couch. He was just kind of feeling generally unwell before death, but it didn't sound like it was anything really serious at all. And at autopsy, they found the classic signs of an opioid overdose, that foam in the airway, an early bronchial pneumonia, urinary retention, again, signs of an opioid overdose, as well as these 7-hydroxy products at the scene. The brand is Opia. I believe there are 30 milligrams of 7-hydroxymetragenine in each tablet, and there's usually about 4 tablets per pack. And obviously a lot of empty packs here, and so he'd been consuming them quite regularly or frequently. At NMS, we did our normal toxicology. We found, some citalopram and SSRI, some antipsychotic olanzapine, again, therapeutic concentrations of both, and just a little bit of metragenine, 14 nanograms per mil. I mean, that's a trivial amount. I mean, that doesn't excite anybody at all. But what we found from that out-of-scope finding, that qualitative, looking qualitatively at metragenine, pseudoindoxil, and the 7-hydroxymetragenine, we found really a quite large amount of both of them. Again, it's qualitatively, but we look at the area counts of 23 million and 14 million respectively for those 2 compounds. Whereas in normal, what a quote unquote normal, kratom or metragenine cases, they might be around 1 million or so. So these were very striking. So we transferred the specimen for confirmation at CFSRE, and it came back with a metragenine pseudoindoxil of 1,100 nanograms per mil, which I believe is the largest that we've found so far. But what's really interesting about this case, though, is from what we know, there were just 7-hydroxymetragenine products in his residence that he had consumed. But we don't see a whole lot of the 7-hydroxy. It's almost like all of that 7-hydroxy got converted all to the pseudoindoxil, which is surprising to me. Again, we don't have a whole lot of cases to go off of. More data would help us out a lot, but this one was very striking. And if I was talking about a very weak partial opioid agonist of metragenine being possibly a cause of death greater than 1,000 nanograms per mil, then over 1,000 nanograms per mil of metragenine pseudoindoxil, which is a full potent opioid receptor agonist, that's probably a pretty clear cause of death in this case, especially with the investigation showing those products at the scene, general, young gentlemen being found dead, as well as the autopsy findings. They're all pointing towards that 7-hydroxymetragine and pseudoindoxil cause of death. So the current state at NMS, I mentioned that we've added the pseudoindoxil and the 7-hydroxy to our TOF screen. Those are things that are only found in our expanded panels. So the expanded panels at NMS use a TOF screen, time of flight mass spec screen. So it's very targeted. The basic panels that use an immunoassay will not pick up metragine or any of these alkaloids at all. So again, they're qualitative for surveillance, but again, we'll reach out to you if something is amiss or out of the ordinary. We do have a confirmation and quantitative method in the works right now. So it's really our metragine method that we're expanding by adding 7-hydroxymetragine to it, as well as metragine pseudoindoxil, and then MGM-15, which is a derivative of dihydro 7-hydroxymetragine. This method is currently in method validation. We just started it, and the rollout should be soon. So within a month, probably closer to maybe 2, we'll have this confirmation method up and running for everybody. And the great thing about having that method up and running is that will allow us to collect more data on those 2 alkaloids, the 7-hydroxy and the pseudoindoxil. The more data you get, the more informed decisions you can make. One thing to point out, though, is that our words as toxicologists and pharmacologists and forensic pathologists, they carry a lot of weight with people, especially in the general public. And so it's really important to note that 7-hydroxymetragine and metragine pseudoindoxil are not kratom. So when someone says kratom or you say kratom, you should be only talking about the leaf from that big tree, and that's it. 7-hydroxymetragine and the metragine pseudoindoxil are chemically modified from metragine. So again, they're not kratom, they're something else. I don't have a name for that something else yet, though, but just know that they're not synonymous with kratom. And the reason why it's important is because the FDA has recommended that the DEA schedule 7-hydroxymetragine, which, depending upon your point of view, may or may not be a good idea at all. But what we don't really want is kratom to be lumped in with that type of ban. Again, kratom has been used relatively safely, especially overseas, for centuries. And to have that lumped in and being banned with these, really potent, full opioid agonists, could be harmful to people that use it to keep themselves off of other opioids and to stave off those withdrawal symptoms. So again, just be careful with your words. So my suggestions are to pay close attention to the case histories and physical evidence. If you suspect kratom use or any of these other 7-hydroxy or pseudoindoxil products, and make sure you order, if you're an NMS client, to order an expanded panel on them. And again, if we find those compounds at elevated concentrations or amounts, we can contact you and discuss confirmation options. Right now, that's through CFSRE, but in a month or 2, that will be in-house at NMS. And I think I'm doing good on time. So I do want to acknowledge what I call our kratom crew. They haven't complained about me calling us that yet, but that's Donna Papson and Bill Schroeder. We work a lot. Well, we communicate all the time in the Teams chat on kratom-related things, sharing cases and articles and information. CFSRE, Alex Tulsky and company, they do a fantastic job of keeping up not only with just all the novel psychoactive substances and the new trends in the drug world, but also on kratom and these other alkaloids as well. And then that very last case that I presented, that's from the forensic pathologist, Tracy Halverson, and she's my favorite toxicologist right now for giving me all that information. So with that, if you have nice comments and questions, I will field those. If they're not nice comments or if they're really, really hard questions, I'll send those to Bill Schroeder because he's a big, strong guy and he can take it. Me, not so much. So thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Brower, and thank you so much for our audience. I see that you all are sending your reactions using those reactions emojis, so thanks so much and keep those coming. We've got just over 10 minutes for Q&A, and as many of you can see, there were a lot of questions. So unfortunately, we will not be able to get to all of the questions, but I will try to prioritize the questions that have, number one, received the most votes, and number two, similar to what Dr. Brower was referring to, would be questions aligned to what he would be able to speak to. So if there are questions that kind of fall out of alignment with what a forensic toxicologist would address, we do have that recorded here and we can follow up with you separately. So with that, the first question is, since 7-hydroxymetragynine is naturally occurring in the plant, is there any analytical technique to determine if it had been synthetically produced versus naturally derived from the plant?
Yeah, so that's kind of not exactly controversial, but kind of. So 7-hydroxymetragynine may not necessarily be present in significant concentrations in the live plant material itself. A lot of it may be from post-harvest production. So not occurring naturally, but after it's been harvested, the leaves picked and then dried, that's when you can have production of the 7-hydroxymetragynine. But to answer your question more specifically, I think it will just come down to the relative ratios of the 7-hydroxymetragynine compared to that of metragynine itself. And the only way to really get a feel for that is just more cases and more data just to get a better feel for it. And right now, I don't have a super good answer, just that I would think that metragynine would predominate over the 7-hydroxy from natural kratom use. And if the 7-hydroxymetragynine is much, much greater than that of metragynine, I would think it's more likely to be a 7-hydroxymetragynine product that was used. But again, we just need more cases to look at and more data to get a better feel for that.
Thank you. The next question, do we have any idea how, quote unquote, pure kratom and metragynine substances are, and the risk of contamination with other opioids?
Could you repeat that first part, please, Tiffany?
It says, and I'll do it without, it has quotes, so I wasn't for sure if that was a critical part of the question, but I'll read it without. Do you have any idea how pure kratom and metragynine substances are, and the risk of contamination with other opioids?
So the purity of like kratom is essentially, again, it's just a leaf, dried, picked from a tree, dried, and then crushed. I think the purity is what you get from the leaf. I don't know if you're talking about contamination with like heavy metals or pesticides, rodenticides, fertilizers and things like that. We don't see a lot of contamination with other drugs at all. There was a case back in 2012, I believe, 2013, 2012, out of Sweden, where a kratom product was adulterated with O-desmethyl tramadol, resulting in, I believe, 7, maybe 8 deaths or so. But that's not something that we've been seeing really at all. I hope that answered it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This next question, and apologies in advance for my pronunciation on some of this. Given that metragynines diastereomers can theoretically also have 7-hydroxymetragynine metabolites, can you talk about the analytical challenge associated with reporting on 7-hydroxymetragynine? Are labs hyphenating or chromatographic resolving all the 7-hydroxymetragenine diastereomers and the
It's okay.
the
You're doing great.
pseudo. Thank you so much, Dr. Brower. All right, yeah, thank you for the motivation. I love the emojis. Thanks to the audience for pumping me up there. A lot of syllables in this question, but the pseudoindoxyl isomers. I hope I didn't miss the question.
No, I think I got it.
You want me to do it again? Okay,
No,
thanks so
no,
much.
not want you to do that again. It's okay. So you're right. So you have all these diastereomers of metragenine, like specialitine and other things that I can't pronounce very well because I don't have the practice like my academic colleagues do. But yeah, so the metragenine diastereomers need to be resolved. And you're right, the 7-hydroxy ones would also have sets of diastereomers as well that would also need to be resolved. Otherwise, you risk the exact same thing I talked about with metragenine, overestimating the concentration of the 7-hydroxy products. And so there's a whole lot that we're figuring out kind of in real time as we go along as to, what the chromatography looks like, what type of and number of peaks that you're looking at in the diastereomers and related compounds, and just being able to separate them, fully. I think that's very important, again, just so that we have accurate concentrations available. As far as other labs and how they're separating them or reporting them, like combined, like 7-hydroxymetragenine, products, lumping them all together as one. I don't really know how labs are doing that.
Thank you so much. Our next question. Have we seen a particular method of consumption as the most common regarding 7-hydroxymetragenine?
So it's funny. There are so many 7-hydroxymetragenine products out there. I mean, they literally have 7-hydroxymetragenine ice cream. I haven't tried it. It sounds weird to me, but you name it, they have it. These people are very clever. But the most common ones I see are those tablets, these like soft chewable tablets that you can buy and put in your mouth, like the ones that we saw in this picture here. Those right here, those are the most common 7-hydroxymetragenine products that I'm aware of.
Thank you so much. The next question, is this similar to cannabis in that when you lose weight, you can re-release the product back into your system?
Oh, that's a good question. I hadn't thought about that, but I don't see why not. I think it could happen. Yeah. As you're losing fat and those fat cells, lysing open, releasing its contents. Yeah, I can see that. And related to THC, where you're always kind of like re-releasing, THC from your cells into your blood and back. I think you kind of see the same thing with metragenine as well. People that have done like single dose studies of kratom tea, they find that there's like residual metragenine, like up to like 7 or 10 days after that first use. So again, it could be just partitioning into your fat and your tissues and then kind of leaching out over time. So I think that's probably a fairly fair, statement in comparison.
Thank you. The next question, is there any research to show if naloxone is effective on metragenine overdoses?
So on kratom overdoses, when talking about this kratom and like teas, capsules, powders, naloxone does not work at all. It's just not an opioid. Whether or not naloxone will work on an overdose of 7-hydroxymetragenine and the pseudoindoxyl isn't really known yet, but theoretically it should, just because it's working on the opioid receptors. So yeah, it should block the binding of those alkaloids to the opioid receptors. So it should work on those, but it does not work on the traditional kratom.
Thank you. And this might be our last question, but not to worry, we will try to follow up with all the questions that are in the chat and in the Q&A if we're not able to get to them before we need to wrap up today to be respectful of time. But the question is, what signals to the pathologist that they should test for metragine?
So metragine itself, just because it's not an opioid, you're not going to see the signs of an opioid overdose at autopsy. Really, nothing would signal it. You'd really have to rely on the investigation, talking to, friends and family, just to get an accurate history of, what else they could have been using. That would just really be the only clue that they have. That and testing for metragine. So if you do tox in-house in your own lab, metragine absolutely should be a part of your panel that you're routinely testing for. Or if you're sending it out to another lab, I prefer NMS labs, obviously, because I like getting paid by them. So if you send it to us, it needs to be that one of those expanded panels using that time of flight mass spec screening technique to capture it. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot else to go on.
Thank you so much. With only about half a minute left on the clock, Dr. Brower, if I could get you to advance to the final slide where we will share what our audience can expect. I did want to take a moment to say thank you very much, Dr. Brower, for sharing with us today. So much good information for a very large audience with a lot of different people. Dr. Brower is a forensic toxicologist who joined NMS Labs in 2022.
All right, we're gonna go, but I hope everybody enjoyed this.
Yes, I hope you guys heard it straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
Kratom is not an opioid.
Let's just have a good night. Have a good night.
Naloxone does not. Yep, naloxone does not work for kratom.
And 7-OH is not kratom.
7-OH is not kratom, nor is pseudoindoxyl.
No.